Hello and welcome to my review of Dragon Ball Z Kakarot. The game is available on PS4, Xbox One, and PC, and having completed the game, all side quests, and even the Platinum Trophy, I am dying to talk about the whole thing. So let's talk about my experience, let's talk about mechanics, story missions, side activities, how much you can do in this game, and how fun it all is. As a big Dragon Ball fan that has maybe played the Dragon Ball story one too many times, I was somewhat skeptical of another Dragon Ball single-player game where you play as a few Dragon Ball characters throughout the Dragon Ball Z story. But this being the biggest one yet, and framed as an RPG with tons of free roaming in what is not exactly an open world but a collection of sandbox areas that you can travel to individually, I went in with an open mind. Overall, I'd say I enjoyed the experience, but damn, this game has a lot of flaws, and nostalgia is what carries most of it. The game took me a total of 50 hours to beat, and that is the full story, side quests, and the Platinum Trophy. There's not a lot of incentive to replay the game, so that's about the total time you can get out of this. I've seen people with way bigger hour counts, and I can understand how they got there, but once you understand how pointless a lot of the side content is, you might think twice before spending 5 hours fishing and collecting orbs. To play through the Dragon Ball story is to play through Kakarot's story missions. These are definitely the best part of the game. The main story moments are accompanied by some of the best anime cutscenes we have ever seen in any video game. They really punctuate the big moments in Dragon Ball Z, sometimes giving it something extra. For instance, Piccolo's despair running to protect Gohan from Nappa's blast was a great touch that's best represented in the game rather than the show itself. These cutscenes are definitely worth watching, even if you don't get the game, just watch them on YouTube. The work they've done here is simply amazing, though watching them in the context of the game makes them even more powerful. The cutscenes aren't all amazing though. If the ones we just talked about could be considered top-tier cutscenes, the game also throws us some mid-tier and low-tier cutscenes. In the mid-tier cutscenes, the character models animate in unique ways, but they haven't received the attention and work that the top-tier cutscenes have. After all, animating a whole story like that would be a massive endeavor. So a lot of the cutscenes were animated like this, which definitely doesn't look as good, but it gets the job done. And then we have the low-tier cutscenes where characters just have minimal animation and you're just scrolling through text. Everything in the story missions is voiced in all types of cutscenes, and you have both English and Japanese voice acting options. Side quests, however, are not voiced at all. That is a privilege only the story missions can enjoy. And as far as the gameplay goes, the structure of these missions is very limited. You either have combat missions where you fight against any types of enemies, you have go talk to this other character types of missions, which is basically going from point A to point B to talk to someone else, or fetch quests, which are definitely overused in this game. Combat can be fun during story missions, however. You encounter new and unique enemies all the time. Each one has their own moveset and unique attacks that you must learn how to avoid and find the opening to deal damage. And the main bosses also have their cinematic moments mid-battle, which can add to the intensity of the fight. We'll talk more about those while talking about combat in a second. The story missions do feel like a love letter to Dragon Ball Z. The game covers the entirety of the Dragon Ball Z story. No Dragon Ball Super, no original Dragon Ball, no movies, just good old Dragon Ball Z. Almost all the scenes from the show were recreated, down to small details like Porunga giving you the OK sign, which only makes it stranger when they decide to skip a cutscene that you fondly remember from the show. For instance, the over 9,000 moment simply is not in the game. The first time Gohan goes Super Saiyan is also not in the game. The Trunks vs Cell fight is also skipped, even though you just fought as Vegeta against Cell right before that moment, and Trunks is actually a playable character. During the Buu arc, you don't play a single fight during the World Martial Arts Tournament. Not a single one. They made the arena, you can free roam around the arena, but not a single fight takes place on that arena. Some very weird corners were cut, especially when other moments have received so much attention to detail. And since nostalgia actually carries a lot of this game, fans of the show are certainly gonna miss these moments. In addition to the story missions, there are a ton of side missions and other activities you can do in the open world. The side missions themselves feature original storylines and dialogue, but honestly, it all feels like a bad filler episode. There are some good moments, some funny moments, but ultimately most of it feels completely pointless. The missions themselves are also incredibly repetitive and follow the same format as the story missions, where you are either fighting someone, talking to someone, or doing a fetch quest. Not to mention that, in addition to that awful quest design, these quests often make you travel between different regions, and every time you do that, you get a loading screen. Sometimes you travel to a different region just to watch a cutscene, forcing you to go through 2 loading screens in a row, and on console, the loading screens are just long enough to make this extremely annoying. Even the Xbox One X has these loading screen problems, PS4 Pro, which was the platform I played on. I've heard that on the PC they are not so bad, especially if you have the game installed on an SSD, but no matter how good your machine is, the fact is, there are still a ton of unnecessary loading screens. There are just way too many, and it's all because the quests were designed to have you travel between different regions. Heck, even the Dragon Balls are designed like this. The Dragon Balls are scattered throughout the different regions. If you want to gather them, you have to sit through 6 or 7 loading screens just to collect them all. And you're not only gonna do that once. Once you summon Shenron, you have to wait 20 minutes of real world time before the Dragon Balls become available again. And you're gonna want to summon Shenron a bunch of times. And that just means loading screen after loading screen. This isn't fun. And if nostalgia carries the story missions a little bit, making you able to overlook the occasional flaw, side quests are 100% carried by nostalgia. Very few of them were actually enjoyable, and that's coming from a Dragon Ball fan. Other than the side missions, a lot of the side activities also felt very pointless because of a single key factor that plagues this entire game. There are no difficulty options, and the game is too easy. Even if you struggle with combat, mashing the attack button will get you most of the way there, and you can buy as many healing items as you want and then use them in battle. There are no cooldowns, you can just keep popping them if you want, which is why for my specific playthrough I made a rule of not using any healing items to try and get some fun out of the combat system, and I did beat the game without using a single healing item during combat. But because the whole game is super easy, doing most of the side activities becomes pointless. For instance, hunting animals and fishing so you can cook them later. These give you permanent stat boosts and temporary bonuses for combat, but the stat boosts are insignificantly small, and the combat is so easy that most of the time you won't even feel the temporary bonuses. There are red ribbon towers everywhere. Once you destroy them, you get some items that might help you in crafting or combat, but you kinda don't need help in combat, and crafting is kinda dull, so the towers become pointless too. You can do time attack races on a vehicle that handles very poorly. With a camera that doesn't help you at all, the driving is not fun. And again, the reward is a bunch of items that you actually don't need. The one thing that's useful is gathering orbs to unlock talents on your talent tree, but gathering orbs isn't fun in the slightest. Fortunately, enemies can also give you orbs after you finish them off, and if you're at least 5 levels above your enemies, you can just fly straight through them, instantly getting the orbs and the XP you'd get from a fight. So I guess that circumvents the problem, but it's solving a problem that shouldn't be there in the first place. None of these side activities are fun whatsoever. The first time they're introduced, they feel novel and it's exciting to try them out, but given how boneless they are, that charm quickly fades. And Kakarot quickly becomes a game where you go from icon to icon completing quests and barely paying attention to the world you're traversing. The one side activity I thoroughly enjoyed were the community boards. Over the course of the game, whether through story missions or side missions, you'll collect soul emblems from your allies and enemies. These go in these different boards called the community boards. All of these boards have a central piece that cannot be moved, but you can choose where to place all the other soul emblems, and each soul emblem has bonuses that are applied once you link it to other specific soul emblems. So the community boards become this puzzle that changes every time you get a new emblem, because you might have new bonuses you want to unlock with this new character. The solution to this puzzle keeps changing over the course of the game, and there are multiple right answers, but figuring out the best answer at each given time was something I really enjoyed doing. But even with this activity that I enjoyed very much, there wasn't any big reward from it. You see, each community board has a set of bonuses that you get every time you level up the board, but once again, with the game being so easy, I barely felt the effects of any board. So I kept working on the boards because I enjoyed it, even if the game wasn't rewarding the time I spent with them all. What ties all of these activities and story missions together, other than fetch quests, is the combat system, which I was very surprised by. When I first saw this game, I made a video saying, well, this is disappointing, because the combat looked like Xenoverse. And you can see the similarities for sure, especially in the way that you can choose which abilities you take into combat. That's very much Xenoverse-like, but Xenoverse wasn't the only reason why I wasn't optimistic. You may find this controversial, but I didn't like the combat in Budokai Tenkaichi 3, or any behind-the-back third-person Dragon Ball game for that matter. I never found the combat fun in those games, and since for me, personally, no one had ever done this type of combat right in a Dragon Ball game before, my hopes for this one were very low. Well, now I can safely say that this is my favorite combat system done from this perspective in a Dragon Ball game. Yes, the combat is mashy. Normally, you only have about 3 combos you can do before you throw a super attack, but its depth comes from its enemies. Because it's not a combat system geared towards multiplayer, fights are not fair. Your opponents can armor through attacks when they feel like it, and they have infinite meter so they can keep throwing super attacks at you. This means that just mashing is gonna get you killed, or at least if you play like me, not using healing items. If you want to use healing items, who cares? This game is a cakewalk. Combat is boring. But if you actually want to challenge yourself and master this combat system, just don't do it. So you're gonna need to be dodging a lot. Luckily, this dodge button does not cost any resources. You can just keep doing it as many times as you want, and it makes your character incredibly mobile, which feels great. Then it's only a matter of finding an opening and unleashing as much damage as you can in a short amount of time. Fighting against multiple enemies at the same time was one of my favorite things to do in this game, because now you're not only dodging and countering one enemy. When you see an opening, there might be an attack coming in from off screen, and it can feel unfair and punishing. But in a game as easy as this, I've found that to be very welcome. And especially once you're able to transform, things get very intense to manage. When you're transformed, you get a damage buff, but your ki slowly depletes. So now you're managing the attacks from 3 different enemies, and you have to not only find the time to attack them, but occasionally charge up your ki so your transformation doesn't go away. And on top of all that, you have the surge meter, which when it's full, gives you a temporary boost in power and access to new, more powerful combos. Managing all of these resources was definitely fun during these encounters. Some training missions where you unlock new abilities put you up against some interesting combinations of characters, and there's also this side activity called the villainous enemies, which when they show up for the first time, they out-level you by a lot. You should not attempt the villainous enemies as soon as they show up, but eventually you catch up to them in level, and these encounters are a lot of fun. If you're gonna do any side activity, I recommend doing these. There's also a nice surprise when you finish them. And of course, during story missions, the boss fights have that little bit extra flair, which makes them feel special. That said, combat did get repetitive, not during these interesting encounters, but whenever you had to fight robots, or Cybermen, or Bobby D's grunts. These random encounters against trash mobs that keep bothering you while you're exploring or gathering get really annoying, because the enemies don't really change that much over the course of the game, so it's like you have to play the same fight over and over again. I liked playing through the story missions. Some of them had a bit of padding. There are some fetch quests in the story missions too, but overall I liked the experience. On the other hand, side missions were very frustrating, but fortunately they're optional, and so are all the other side activities. I did want to get the soul emblem, so I ended up not skipping any side missions, and also this game is an RPG, and if you don't level up in an RPG, you might find yourself having a hard time later on, though a hard time in an easy game like this would actually be welcome. But I also quickly realized that even though this game looks like an RPG, it very much isn't an RPG until the end of the Frieza saga. Story missions give you so much XP, and side missions and combat give you so little that if you don't do any side missions whatsoever, you'll fight Frieza at the same level as you would if you did everything you could. It's a fake RPG up to this point, but it does open up right after the Frieza saga. Side quests become more rewarding. You can start fighting the villainous enemies. You can also manage your party, pick the active character, pick your supports, at least outside of the story missions. It almost becomes the RPG it promised to be. But even after the Frieza saga, occasionally a cutscene will just give you a ridiculous amount of XP to fit the story. For instance, Goku and Vegeta both start the Buu saga by getting around 15 million XP each. And if that number sounds ridiculous, it's because it is. So in this very inflated experience economy, the little things like food buffs continue being completely meaningless throughout the entire game. The game is still easy, the side activities are still bad. The only time I was able to make this game hard was whenever I tried to tackle some very high level enemies. Someone I definitely should not be fighting at that time, but the result was also disappointing. You see, this being an RPG, it's all about numbers, so just being out-leveled means that you deal less damage and you take more damage. Well, if you're able to dodge attacks and counterattack at the appropriate time, fighting against a higher level enemy doesn't mean that you have to play better, just means that you have to play consistent for a longer period of time. So fighting higher level enemies was also boring in my opinion, because they just take longer to die. There's a lot they could have done to make this game more challenging with this same combat system. A few AI tweaks, making them dodge incoming attacks, blocking more, helping each other out when in a team instead of randomly throwing attacks would have gone a long way, but ultimately they didn't do that. So the game is what it is. A final note on presentation: while the top tier cutscenes look absolutely superb, some of the best anime visuals we have ever seen in a video game, the game itself, the character models, the fighting animations, they all look good honestly. Not extraordinary like the cutscenes, not revolutionary, but good. they get the job done. I also like the variety of environments and the little touches like the water reacting to attacks or to your super dash. And then sound-wise, I really like the sound design on this one. When you're fighting against multiple enemies, for instance, your camera is focused on a single enemy. So sound becomes that much more important to dodge attacks coming from off camera. And I found that each attack has its own set of audio cues, from the most obvious ones like characters yelling out their attacks to some more subtle sound effects, which was very cleverly done. And then we have the original show's soundtrack, which weirdly enough wasn't always used correctly. Sometimes you'd have a fight scene and the exploration song would be playing, so that was weird. But overall, I'm happy with this game's presentation. It's not groundbreaking with the exception of the cutscenes, but it's good. With all that said, it's time to score this game, and if you're new here, we use letters for our scoring system. We've got bad games over here, we've got okay or mediocre games over here, and then we've got the good games. And this is my score for Dragon Ball Z Kakarot. It's a good game, but only if you're a huge Dragon Ball fan. I consider myself to be a big Dragon Ball fan, and to me this game was mid-tier. I can only imagine how bad this game is to someone who is not a Dragon Ball fan. Fan service is everywhere, so nostalgia is going to carry most of this game. And if your nostalgia is strong, you'll be able to overlook most of this game's flaws and have a pleasant experience. But if not, then those flaws will definitely get in the way. This being a game that tells the whole Dragon Ball story, I really wanted it to be a game that I could use to introduce other people into Dragon Ball, but I don't think it's a good game for that. Yes, it does tell the entire story, but if you're gonna learn that story while being pestered by fetch quests, then maybe Dragon Ball won't leave a good impression on them. And ultimately, I think this show deserves better. Good Dragon Ball games should not be hard to make, but we just keep getting these okay mid-tier games, and people keep buying them, so what do I know? That's just my review of Dragon Ball Z Kakarot. If you guys are playing it and would like to share your opinions on the game, feel free to do it in the comments down below. That way, if someone comes to this video looking for opinions, they have heard mine, but they can read yours as well. And as always, thank you very much for watching. My name is Globku, and I'll see you next time. Bye.